David was a soldier in the Human Federation. His missions usually took him to the edges of space, where danger and mystery awaited him. Today, however, he was on a mission that seemed simple enough. His job was to investigate an old alien colony. On a distant planet, the colony had been abandoned for many years, but recently, strange signals had come from it. His orders were clear. Find out what was happening. The planet was barren, with only ruins and dust scattered across the surface. The sky was gray, and the air was still, as if the land had given up on life long ago. As David walked through the broken structures of what once was a thriving settlement, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The place felt empty, but not in a quiet way. There was a sense of loss, like something important had been taken. He moved cautiously, scanning the area with his handheld device. It wasn't long before he heard something, a soft, whimpering sound, like a cry for help. David froze and looked around. He couldn't see anyone. The noise came again, faint but clear. It was coming from an alley between two collapsed buildings. David approached slowly, his hand on the grip of his sidearm. As he turned the corner, he saw her, a small alien child crouched near a pile of rubble, her hands covering her face. Her body was covered in dirt and tears, and she looked up at David. With wide, frightened eyes, the child wasn't human. She had pale blue skin with small spots of darker blue. Her eyes were large and black, and her features were delicate but sharp. She looked lost and alone, as if she had been through something unimaginable. For a moment, David just stared, unsure of what to do. He had never seen anything like this before. Are you all right?" David asked softly, stepping closer but keeping his distance. The child looked up at him, and her eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words came out in a broken, desperate tone. Please marry my mom. She's all have left." David's heart skipped a beat. The request made no sense to him. He had seen some strange things in his time, but this was beyond anything he could understand. He knelt down, trying to be gentle with her. "Your mom?" David asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Where is she? What happened to you?" The child shook her head and wiped her eyes, tears still streaming down her face. "She's hurt. She needs help. Please, human. You're strong. You can protect us." David didn't know what to think. We had been trained for many things, but he wasn't prepared for this. He had heard of alien species that lived on distant planets, but he had never encountered one quite like this. He didn't know why the child was asking him to marry her mother, but he could tell that she was desperate. "Okay," David said softly, trying to reassure the child. "I'll help you. I'll find your mother, and we'll figure this out." The child nodded, her face filled with hope. "Thank you, human. You don't understand, but you're the only one who can save us." David helped the child to her feet, noticing how fragile she looked. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old by human standards, but her species aged differently, looked up at him with eyes full of trust and desperation, as though her life and her mother's depended on him. "Come on," David said, offering his hand. "Let's go find your mom." The child took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. They began walking through the ruins together, David looking around for any sign of the child's mother. The planet was eerily quiet, and David couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. He kept his senses sharp, knowing that the child had been hiding for a reason. The attack on this colony wasn't just a random event. Something bigger was happening, and he was about to get caught up in it as they walked. The child began to speak again, telling David about her mother. She spoke in a soft, sorrowful voice, recounting stories of a time when her people had been strong. Her mother was a leader, a warrior who commanded respect and admiration. But after the attack, everything had changed. The child's mother had been injured badly, and they had been forced to flee. The child's world had fallen apart, and now she had only one thing left, her mother, and the hope that David could help them. "We were safe," the child said, her voice shaking. "But then the bad people came. They took everything from us. Now, we have nowhere to go." David listened intently. He didn't understand all of it, but he could hear the fear in the child's voice. She had lost so much, and now she was putting all her hope in him. Where are we going? David asked, glancing around. To the shelter, the child replied, pointing. Toward a distant hill. It's hidden. My mom is waiting for me there. David nodded and led the way, his mind racing with questions. Who had attacked this place? What kind of enemy were they dealing with? And why had the child asked him to marry her mother? There were too many unknowns. David knew one thing for sure. Couldn't leave this child alone. They reached the shelter just as the sun began to set. The building was half collapsed, a remnant of a once thriving home, but it provided cover.
Ow.
Inside, David found the alien mother lying on the floor, weak and injured. She looked up at him with a mix of fear and recognition. The child ran to her. Mother, kneeling beside her. Mom, he's here. The human is here to help. The alien mother's eyes widened. She seemed to struggle to sit up, but David rushed over to assist her. She was weaker than David had imagined. Her breathing was shallow, and she winced in pain as she tried to move. You must be her mother, David said gently, his heart going out to both of them. I'll help you. We'll get you to safety. The mother's eyes locked with his, and for a brief moment she said nothing. Then, in a weak, strained voice, she spoke. Thank you, she said. But please, take care of her. She's all I have. Left? David wasn't sure what to say. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him, but one thing was clear. The child's plea was not just a request. It was a... David sat beside the alien mother, watching as she slept. Her breathing was still uneven, but she seemed to be in a somewhat calmer state. The child, whose name David learned was Lyra, sat nearby, keeping a watchful eye on her mother. The shelter was cold, the remnants of a once thriving place now abandoned and ruined. The sky outside was turning dark, and the wind howled, making the atmosphere even more desolate. David wasn't sure what he had gotten himself into. He had signed up for the military, ready to face the challenges of space, but nothing had prepared him for a situation like this. Lyra had led him here with such hope in her eyes, and now he was tasked with something far bigger than himself. Lyra looked up at him and broke the silence. Do you really think you can help us? She asked quietly, her small voice carrying a weight beyond her years. David met her gaze, trying to give her the reassurance she desperately needed. I'm doing everything I can, but I need to know more. What happened to your people? Who did? This to your colony? Lyra hesitated before answering. She stood up and moved to sit next to her mother. It's a long story, she said, her voice shaky, but I'll try to explain. My mom was a leader, was strong. She led our people, kept us safe, but we made enemies. We were a peaceful people, but some saw our kindness as weakness. They came to destroy us. David sat back, his mind racing. The galaxy was full of power struggles, and this wasn't the first time he had heard of peaceful people being taken advantage of by stronger forces. But something about Lyra's words tugged at his heart. These weren't just enemies, they were ruthless, and they had taken everything from these beings. What do you mean they came to destroy you? David asked, leaning forward. Who were they? What did they want? Lyra looked down at the floor, unable to meet David's eyes. They were a group of mercenaries, she began, led by a warlord named Corin. He's dangerous, and my mom tried to stop him, but she was injured. We had to flee. Corin doesn't care about anything, just wants power. He'll stop at nothing to get it. David processed the information. Mercenaries were never good news. Warlords like Corin often had armies of their own, and without a strong leader, the people had little hope. He looked at Lyra, seeing the fear in her eyes. You said Corin doesn't care about anything, David said, his voice serious. That includes you and your mother, doesn't it? Lyra nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Yes, he wants to wipe out my people. He doesn't care that my mom was once a leader. He only cares about taking everything. We're just in the way. David stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, the dark sky stretched endlessly, and he could see the faint glow of distant stars. He couldn't help but feel the weight of Lyra's words. The child's plea for help, asking him to marry her mother, now made more sense. She wasn't just asking for a human to protect them. She was asking for hope. hope that her mother could regain her strength, that they could fight back against Corin's cruelty. He turned to Lyra. "I'm going to help you," he said firmly. "I'm going to find Corin and stop him. He won't hurt anyone else." Lyra's eyes brightened with a mix of relief and gratitude. "You will?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope. "But how? You're just one person. We're weak. We don't have an army." David's face softened. "I'm not just one person," he said, "and you're not alone. I'll find allies. We'll fight together. But first, we need to get your mother to safety. I'll carry her if I have to. I need to get her to a place where she can rest and heal." Lyra nodded, her grip on her mother's hand tightening. "I know a place," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It's hidden. Only my mom and a few others knew about it. It's far away from here, and it's safe." David helped Lyra lift her mother, gently, his strength steady, as he carried the injured alien woman. He followed Lyra as she led the way, weaving through the ruins of the abandoned colony. The landscape was desolate, and the only sounds were their footsteps and the distant wind. David kept a sharp eye out, knowing that danger could be anywhere. As they moved, Lyra explained more about her mother. "My mom was a warrior," she said. "She fought in many battles to protect our people. But after the attack, she was hurt. She can't fight anymore, and I don't know how to help her. That's why I need you. You're strong. You can protect her." David's heart ached for Lyra. The weight of her responsibility, her fear for her mother, was too much for someone so young. But it was clear to him that this child had learned strength from her mother's example. "I'll do my best," David said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'll protect both of you. But we need to get your mom to safety first." They walked for hours, and eventually they reached a hidden cave deep in the forest. The entrance was concealed by thick foliage, making it nearly impossible to spot unless you knew where to look. As they entered, the cave opened up into a spacious, hidden sanctuary. There were signs of life's simple bedding, medical supplies, and a small makeshift kitchen. Lyra helped David lay her mother down on one of the beds. The alien woman's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at them with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "Thank you, human," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what I would have done without you." David smiled gently, though it was clear he still had a long road ahead. "You're safe now. We'll figure out what to do next." As he settled in, he realized that this was only the beginning. Corin would come looking for them, and they needed to be ready. But now all David could do was give them the one thing they needed most. David sat beside the fire that crackled softly in the center of the cave, his thoughts swirling. Outside was dark, and the air was thick with tension. He had managed to get Lyra and her mother to safety, but now the real challenge was beginning. The warlord Corin was still out there, and David knew that it was only a matter of time before he would come searching for them. The idea of confronting such a ruthless enemy weighed heavily on him, but he couldn't turn back now. Lyra had settled beside her mother, who was still weak, but now resting more peacefully. The alien woman's breathing had steadied, and David could see that she was slowly regaining some strength. He had placed a blanket over her, and she seemed to sleep soundly, though her face remained tight with pain. Lyra, however, wasn't asleep. She was wide awake, her eyes staring into the flames. David could see the sadness in her expression, the worry that never seemed to leave her face. He walked over to her, sitting down across from her by the fire. "I know it's hard," David said, his voice low and comforting, "but your mom will get better. We'll figure things out." Lyra nodded, but she didn't look at him. "She's strong," Lyra said quietly. "But she's also human, just like everyone else. She can only take so much before it all catches up to her." She paused, and David could hear the weight of her words. "I don't know what to do. She was everything to our people. Now she's just another broken soul in the galaxy." David sat in silence for a moment, thinking about Lyra's words. He understood how much the child cared for her mother. There was love in Lyra's voice, but there was also a deep sense of fear. Fear that her mother would never be the same. Fear that they were both lost, without a way forward. It reminded him of how people felt when they faced loss, when their lives had been upended by forces beyond their control. Tell me more. Your mom, David said softly, wanting to understand more. What was she like before all this happened? Lyra's eyes flickered, and for a moment a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She was a leader. She wasn't just strong, she was wise too. She helped our people stay united, even when things were tough. She made sure everyone had what they needed. She taught me everything I know. David listened closely, watching as Lyra's face softened. The way she spoke about her mother made it clear how much respect and admiration she had for her. What happened to her during the attack? David asked, his voice gentle. Lyra hesitated for a moment, but then she spoke again, her voice quieter. Now, it happened so fast. Corrin's forces came without warning. They attacked us in the dead of night. My mom tried to protect us. She fought them off, but it wasn't enough. She was injured, had to run. She told me to leave her behind, but I wouldn't listen. I couldn't. Lyra's voice cracked as she spoke, and David could see the pain in her eyes. I couldn't. Leave her alone, she whispered. She's my mom. She's all I have left. David felt a deep sympathy for Lyra. He could see the struggle in her, the pain of having to be strong when she was just a child. She had already been through so much, and now she was dealing with the possibility of losing the one person who meant everything to her. David reached out and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You're doing the right thing, David said, his voice firm with reassurance. You're doing everything you can to help her, and I'm here to help you. Both. We'll figure out how to stop Corrin. We'll find a way to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else. Lyra looked up at him, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. You really mean that? She asked, her voice full of uncertainty. David nodded, a small smile on his face. I do. I won't let Corrin get away with this. Just then, the alien mother stirred in her sleep. She let out a soft groan, her eyes fluttering open, her gaze locked onto Lyra, and she slowly reached out a hand to touch her daughter's cheek. Lyra leaned down, taking her mother's hand in her own. Mom, Lyra said, her voice filled with relief. You're awake. The mother smiled weakly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that David couldn't ignore. You're safe, she whispered. You're safe, my little one. Lyra nodded, holding her mother's hand tightly. I brought someone to help, she said. Glancing at David, this is David. He's going to help us. The mother turned her head slightly to look at David. There was a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. You're the first human I've met who hasn't tried to destroy us. David felt a pang of guilt at her words. Humans, like all species, had made their mistakes. But this moment, this family in front of him reminded him that there was always more to a story than what was first seen. I'm just here to help, David said, his voice steady. I promise I'll protect both of you. The alien mother's eyes closed again, and her breathing became more steady. Lyra gently brushed a strand of hair away from her mother's face, her expression softening as she looked down at her. She was the strongest warrior I knew, Lyra said quietly, more to herself than to David. But now, she's just a mother who wants to keep her child safe. David couldn't help but admire the strength in both of them. Lyra's bravery to keep her mother safe, and the mother's determination to protect her daughter, despite her injuries, was something David had never seen before. We'll keep you safe, David said, a quiet promise in the dim light of the cave. We're in this together. As the night stretched on, the weight of what lay ahead settled on David's shoulders. Corrin would not stop until he had everything he wanted, but David was determined. His family had suffered enough. He wouldn't let them be destroyed. Whatever it took, he would make sure they had a chance to. David stood at the entrance of the cave, staring out into the dark expanse of the planet. The wind howled through the trees, sending the leaves scattering across the ground. It was quiet, but David knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Corrin's mercenaries were ruthless. He had seen their kind before, soldiers who would do anything for money, who would destroy entire civilizations for the promise of power. He had no illusions about the danger they posed. Inside the cave, Lyra sat beside her mother, who had finally fallen into a deep, healing sleep. The alien woman's injuries had been serious, but with rest and care, she was starting to recover. David had done what he could with the limited supplies in the cave, but he knew it wouldn't be enough for long. They needed a real plan, and they needed it fast. Lyra was talking softly to her mother when David turned back toward them. The little girl's voice was a comforting sound in the otherwise still night. David took a deep breath and stepped back into the cave, the cold air biting at his skin. "We can't stay here forever," David said, his voice steady as he knelt down beside Lyra. "Corin will come for us. We need to be ready." Lyra looked up at him, her face filled with concern. "What should we do? Where can we go?" David thought. For a moment, the planet was full of ruins, and there were scattered hideouts across the surface, places where survivors had hidden during the war. But they were all far from here. They couldn't afford to travel through the open ground without risking capture. They needed to stay hidden until they were strong enough to fight back. "We need to find allies," David said, his voice calm. "People who can help us fight Corin's forces. But we can't do that alone. We need to make contact with other survivors." Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes full of uncertainty.
But how do we do that?
"My mom always told me we had to trust people. But she's not well, and I don't know who we can trust anymore." David understood her fear. Trust was something that was hard to come by in a galaxy torn apart by war. But he had seen enough to know that there were still good people out there. People who fought for something more than just survival. "We'll find them," David said, his voice firm. "I'll make sure we do. But first we need to get your mother to a safer place. Somewhere she can rest and heal." As he spoke, a sudden noise cut through the night. A low rumble, followed by a loud crash. David's heart skipped a beat. The sound came from the direction of the ruins, and the mercenaries had arrived. They were already on their way. David jumped to his feet, grabbing his weapon and checking its charge. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. They couldn't afford to wait. They had to move now. "Lyra," David said urgently, "get your mother up. We need to leave. Right now." Lyra's eyes widened in fear, but she didn't hesitate. She ran to her mother's side and gently shook her awake. "Mom, we have to go," Lyra said, her voice filled with panic. "They're coming. We have to leave now." The alien woman groggily opened her eyes, her face pale but determined. I'm not well enough to fight," she whispered, her voice weak. "But you have to keep her safe, David. You have to protect her." David nodded, his jaw clenched. "I will. I'll keep both of you safe. I promise." They hurried out of the cave, keeping low and moving as quickly as possible. The wind was fierce and the darkness made it hard to see, but David's instincts kept him on alert. He could feel the presence of danger closing in, and his heart raced with each step. They moved through the dense forest, avoiding the open paths and sticking to the shadows. David knew the mercenaries would be searching for them, and the last thing he wanted was to lead them straight to their location. Every movement had to be calculated, every step taken with purpose. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sound of footsteps grew louder. David's heart pounded in his chest. They were getting closer. He could hear the mercenaries' voices now, shouting orders to each other as they searched for any sign of the missing survivors. The hunt was on. David stopped abruptly, signaling for Lyra and her mother to remain quiet. They crouched behind a large boulder, holding their breath as the mercenaries passed by. David peered over the rock, watching them move past. There were at least a dozen of them, armed and moving swiftly. They were well-trained, but they were also looking in all the wrong places. They had no idea where David and the others were hiding. Once the last of the mercenaries had passed, David motioned for Lyra and her mother to follow. They continued their journey, moving silently through the forest. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The longer they waited, the more likely it was that the mercenaries would catch their trail. After several more hours of cautious movement, they finally reached a small settlement tucked away in a valley. It was a hidden community of survivors, people who had escaped the war and now lived off the land. Far from the reach of Corin and his mercenaries, David approached the leader of the settlement, a tall, sturdy man named Yarrick, who had a deep scar across his cheek. Yarrick looked at David with suspicion at first, but after a brief conversation, he agreed to take them in. The leader of the settlement promised that they would provide food, shelter, and a place for the mother to heal. David could feel the weight of the situation lift, but he knew it wasn't over. They still had a long fight ahead of them. Corin would not stop until he had what he wanted, and David was determined to make sure that he failed. As they settled into the settlement, David knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for survival wasn't over, and the battle for the future of Lyra's people had only just begun. But for the first time in what felt like forever, David allowed himself a moment of peace. They were safe for now, and that was... The settlement was quiet. The survivors here had built a simple life, making homes out of what they could find and relying on each other for support. But despite the peaceful surroundings, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were always one step away from danger. Every noise, every movement outside the camp kept him on edge. Lyra's mother, still weak from her injuries, was recovering in one of the small huts provided by the settlement. Lyra had stayed by her side, never leaving her mother's side for too long. It was clear that the bond between them was unbreakable. Forged through hardship and love, David spent his days training with the survivors. They needed to be ready. Corin's forces were still out there, and they had no way of knowing how long it would take for them to track the group down. David worked hard to teach them basic combat techniques, his military experience proving valuable. The survivors were eager to learn, though their hands shook with fear. They were civilians, not warriors, but David could see the determination in their eyes. They were willing to fight for their future. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a deep orange, David sat outside, taking a moment to catch his breath. The days had been long, and the weight of his responsibility felt heavier with each passing hour. His thoughts were interrupted when Lyra approached, her face serious.
David,
Lyra began, her voice quiet. "Mom, she wants to see you." David stood up and nodded, brushing the dirt from his hands. "I'll go now." Lyra led him to the small hut where her mother lay. The alien woman was sitting up now, her injuries healing, though she still appeared weak. Her once strong features now looked fragile, and the strength that had defined her seemed to be fading. But her eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, still held a fire that no injury could extinguish. "David," she said, her voice soft but steady, "thank you. I don't know how to repay you for what you've done. You've protected us when we had no hope." David shook his head. "You don't need to repay me. I'm here because I believe in what you're fighting for. Your people, they deserve peace." The alien woman gave him a small, tired smile. "You are kind, human, but you don't understand. We are a people at war. Our enemies don't care about peace. They only care about power. And now, because of them, my people are scattered, lost, and broken. I may never be able to lead them again." David sat down beside her, looking at her with sympathy. "That's not true," he said. "You may be injured, but your people need you. They need your wisdom. They need your strength."
"Oh, Lyra's."
Mother closed her eyes briefly as if thinking deeply about his words. "I wanted to believe that, but I've seen too much destruction. My people have been driven to the brink. I may never be able to unite them again. I may never be able to stop Corin." David reached out and placed a hand on hers. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "I'll help you. We'll help you. Your daughter, these people, and me will fight, and we'll show Corin that he can't win. You can still lead even if it's not in the way you imagined." Lyra's mother opened her eyes and looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "You are a brave man, David, but you don't know what it's like to carry the weight of an entire people on your shoulders. It's not something you can fix with one battle." David felt the weight of her words, but he wasn't ready to give up. "It's not about one battle. It's about fighting every day. We can't give up. Not now. Not when there's still hope." Alien woman studied him for a moment, then slowly nodded. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps I've forgotten how to hope." Lyra had been standing in the doorway, watching quietly. She walked into the room and sat next to her mother. "Mom," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "don't give up. You taught me that we can always find a way, You taught me that nothing is impossible." Her mother looked at her daughter, and for the first time since David had met her, he saw a flicker of that old strength return. It was a brief moment, but it was enough. David stood up, giving them some space. "I'll go check on the others," he said, sensing that Lyra needed this time with her mother. As he stepped outside, he found the other survivors gathered near the edge of the settlement. The day's training had ended, and they were now discussing what to do next. David approached them, ready to offer his guidance. But he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. The sky in the distance had darkened. There was a low rumble of thunder. A storm was coming. But David knew it wasn't the storm. That worried him. It was the sound of the engines, the unmistakable hum of ships in the air. David's heart raced as he turned toward the survivors. "We need to move now," he shouted. The group looked up, startled by his sudden urgency. "What is it?" one of them asked. "Corrin's forces," David said, his voice tight with fear. "They're here." In that moment, everything shifted. The peace that had settled over the settlement for a brief time was shattered. The calm, simple life they had built was no longer safe. They had known that this day would come, but now that it was here, David's resolve hardened. "We're not running," David said, his voice steady but fierce. "We're fighting." The survivors began to gather their weapons, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and determination. David knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The mercenaries were well armed, and they would not show mercy. It had made a promise. To protect Lyra and her mother, he would keep that promise, no matter the cost, as the first ship landed in the clearing nearby. David stood at the front of the group, ready to lead them into the fight. This was the moment they had all been preparing for. They had no choice but to stand and fight for their... The ground trembled beneath David's feet as the ships touched down with a low rumble. The survivors in the settlement quickly gathered their things, their faces filled with a mix of fear and determination. David could see the terror in their eyes, but he also saw something else, a resolve that hadn't been there before. These people were ready to fight, ready to stand up against the forces that had already taken so much from them. David stood at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon. He could hear the sound of engines and weapons powering up. Corrin's mercenaries were here, and they were not going to stop until they had destroyed everything. His heart pounded, but he pushed the fear down. They had to stand their ground. Lyra stood beside him, her small frame trembling, but her eyes bright with determination. She was just a child, but in that moment she was as brave as any soldier. Her mother, though still weak, had insisted on being moved to the front, where she could see the battle unfold. Her eyes, though tired, were filled with the same fierce resolve as her daughter's. "We're ready," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We're going to fight, right?" David turned to her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Yes, we fight. But we fight smart. We don't rush into battle without a plan." He turned back to face the settlement. The mercenaries were already spreading out, their heavy boots crushing the earth beneath them. They were well-trained, organized, and heavily armed. David knew that the survivors didn't stand a chance against them in a direct fight, but that wasn't the plan. They needed to use their environment, their knowledge of the land, and their courage. "I need everyone to listen," David called out. Raising his voice above the noise of the approaching ships, "We're not going to take them head-on. We'll use the terrain, the caves, and the trees. Stay low, stay hidden, and don't give them a clear shot. We have the element of surprise." The survivors nodded, moving quickly to their assigned positions. David's heart raced as he watched them. These weren't soldiers. They were families, farmers, and workers who had been forced into a war they never wanted. But now they had a chance to protect what was left of their home. David looked at Lyra's mother, who was sitting against a rock, her face pale but her expression determined. She was weaker than she had been before, but she still had the strength to lead. The burden of leadership was clear in her eyes, but there was also something else, a glimmer of hope. She was beginning to believe that maybe they could win this fight. "Are you sure you're up for this?" David asked her, his voice soft. She nodded, her gaze steady. "I may not be able to fight like I once did, but I will do whatever I can. My people, they deserve to survive." David nodded, respect filling him. He had seen many leaders in his time, but none of them carried the weight of responsibility as heavily as this woman did. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting for the survival of an entire species. As the first wave of mercenaries began to move toward the settlement, David signaled to the survivors. They moved swiftly, hiding in the shadows of the trees and behind rocks. The ground was still and tense. Every person holding their breath as they waited for the first sign of movement. David crouched behind a large rock, his weapon ready. He could hear the mercenaries getting closer, their voices muffled by the distance, but their presence unmistakable. They were coming, and David knew this was their last chance. If they didn't strike now, it would be too late. Lyra was beside him, her small hands gripping a makeshift weapon, a blunt, heavy object that she could barely hold. She had insisted on being part of the fight, and David couldn't deny her the right to protect her home. But he also knew he couldn't let her get hurt. "You stay here," David said, his voice firm. "You're not ready for this." Lyra shook her head. "I'm ready. I have to be. My mom needs me." David hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. He wasn't going to stop her. She was as much a part of this fight as anyone. He just hoped she'd stay safe. The first mercenary came into view, his boots crunching the dirt. David held his breath, waiting for the right moment. The mercenary paused for a second, scanning the area, then moved closer. David raised his weapon, taking aim. But before he could fire, there was a sudden shout from the trees. The ambush had begun. The survivors sprang from their hiding spots, taking the mercenaries by surprise. The first wave was quickly overwhelmed, and for a moment, it seemed like they might actually win this fight. David fired his weapon, taking down a mercenary who had been aiming at Lyra. She ducked behind a rock, her eyes wide with fear but determined to keep fighting. But then more mercenaries appeared, emerging from the shadows with reinforcements. David's heart sank. They had underestimated the size of Corin's forces. The survivors were holding their own, but they were outnumbered, and the mercenaries were beginning to regroup. David's mind raced. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. "Fall back," David shouted. "Regroup at the caves. Move now." Survivors turned and ran, retreating into the trees. David followed, firing behind him to cover their retreat. The mercenaries pursued, but they couldn't keep up with the survivors' speed and knowledge of the land. They reached the caves, their temporary refuge, and barricaded themselves inside. David's heart pounded as he caught his breath. Had survived the first wave, but the battle wasn't over. Corin would come. He would come with everything he had, and they would need to be ready. Lyra's mother approached David, her face grim. "We can't run forever," she said. "We have to end this." David nodded. "We will, but not yet. Not until we've got the advantage." He knew this wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about winning the war. And to do that, they needed more than just weapons. They needed unity. They needed to